Good evening and welcome to Choices, Foreign Policy Issues in the 2020 Election. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we are so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. We invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other sessions in the Choices Election Issues series, other upcoming events, and how to join as a member on our website at irckc.org. The 2020 presidential election will present the American people with consequential choices around international challenges and the future of US foreign policy. In these 8 weeks leading up to November 3rd, we're talking with notable experts on foreign policy issues relevant to this year's election and what comes next. Rather than advocate a particular approach or outcome, the Nonpartisan Choices series is meant to inform voters through a presentation of historical context and a detailed examination of the foreign policy platforms of the major party candidates. We welcome diverse perspectives and encourage the community to join us in meaningful discourse around these issues of global importance. We hope you'll join us in this way this evening as we dive into tariffs and trade. We welcome your questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share the other conversations in the Choices series as we consider a range of critical foreign policy issues in the coming weeks. We are grateful to our sponsors who have made this evening's program and the Choices series possible. In particular, supporting series sponsors Nancy C. Messer, the University of Missouri, and Buttonwood Financial Group. Thank you for recognizing the timeliness and relevance of these conversations. We also express our gratitude to this evening's global conversation sponsor, the Greater Kansas City Foreign Trade Zone. We'll be hearing from them shortly. Thanks too to sustaining conversation sponsors Nicole Gresham-Perry and the International Trade Council of Greater Kansas City. We congratulate the ITC on their 75th anniversary and encourage you to check out their 75th annual meeting on Thursday, September 17th, featuring economist Chris Keel. Special thanks to our educational partner for this evening's discussion, the Bertelsmann Foundation, whose resource on trade we'll share in the chat box shortly. Learn more about their work at bfna.org. Shortly, or it looks like after a little while, we'll be happy to introduce President and CEO of the Greater Kansas City Foreign Trade Zone, Al Figley. Looks like we might be having a little technical difficulty getting Al on the line, so we'll work that out. And he will share some words with you. But for now, I will turn it over to our moderator for this evening's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. A true friend of the International Relations Council, Raj Bhala joined the University of Kansas Law faculty in 2003, and he serves as the Brenneisen Distinguished Professor. One of the world's topmost scholars and teachers in international trade law, Raj has worked in 29 countries. He is a member of England's Royal Society for Asian Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations, American Law Institute, and Fellowship of Catholic Scholars, among other organizations. He practiced international banking law at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which twice granted him the President's Award for Excellence, and is a senior advisor to Denson's law firm. And particularly relevant to us tonight, he is a Bloomberg columnist who writes a column called On Point for Bloomberg Quint based in Mumbai. We will be sharing his most recent column, which examines tonight's very topic in the chat box. And Raj, before I hand it off to you, it looks like Al is on the line now. Let me see if we can get him here to offer some words of welcome. Al, if you're able to turn on your camera. Okay, Raj, we might need to circle back to Al at the end, but I will hand it off to you to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you to the International Relations Council and all of its sponsors. It is truly a thrill to be moderating this presentation by the former U.S. Trade Representative, Ambassador Ron Kirk. Let me start by introducing him. Ambassador Kirk is Senior of Counsel at Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher in the Dallas and Washington, D.C. offices. He is co-chair of the International Trade Practice Group and a member of the Sports Law, Public Policy, Crisis Management, and Private Equity Practice Groups. Ambassador Kirk focuses on providing strategic advice to companies with global interests. He joined the firm in April 2013. Before then, he served as the 16th United States Trade Representative and was a member of President Barack Obama's cabinet. He served as the president's principal trade advisor, negotiator, and spokesperson. Ambassador Kirk was nominated to be the USTR by President Barack Obama and confirmed by the US Senate in 2009. As USTR, he was responsible for the development and oversight of US trade policy, strategy, negotiation, implementation, enforcing multilateral, regional, bilateral, and sector-specific trade agreements. Ambassador Kirk successfully negotiated the conclusion and congressional passage of trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, and Korea. He also did so with respect to Russia's entry in the World Trade Organization. He dealt with major, broad, deep issues on agriculture, industry, services, investment, intellectual property, environment, labor, development, and other preference programs for developing countries. He's got 30 years of diverse legislative and economic experience at the local, state, and federal levels. He was the first African-American mayor of Dallas from 1995 to 2001, and he earned an extraordinary reputation for bringing together diverse coalitions to get things done. And during his tenure as mayor, Ambassador Kirk expanded Dallas's outreach to the world through trade programs, trade missions, the Foreign Trade Zone, and other initiatives. He also helped bring to Dallas over 45,000 new jobs and secure investment of at least $3.5 billion. He also increased the public safety budget in Dallas.
Raj, I don't want you to read. You don't have to read that. You obviously got the long version. You're being way too kind.
Let me wrap it up with this. 3 points. First, he's married to Matrice Ellis Kirk. And as we were saying in our very enjoyable meet and greet session, he's got two lovely daughters, Elizabeth and Catherine. He's a patron of the arts, which he can tell you. And I will just conclude the introduction with 2 points. Ambassador Kirk was one of the early officials to warn us about Chinese intellectual property practices. And second of all, he's one of the rare officials ever at the USTR to link trade policy at the macro level with urban and regional development in cities like Kansas City and Dallas. So with that, again, it's a great honor to be with you. And the Zoom podium is yours.
Raj, thanks for that exhaustive resume. That's not Raj's fault. For those of you on the call, I'm sure he pulled that off the long version from our law firm. But Matthew, and to the International Relations Council, thanks for having me again. I'm thrilled to share the Zoom microphone with someone as adept and versed in trade as Professor Bhala is, and so many others of you that I had a chance to meet in the chat room. I am a longtime member of our World Affairs Council here in Dallas, so I always enjoyed these discourses with various international relations councils around the country, and have had an interesting, fun relationship between Dallas and Kansas. Raj mentioned that I served as mayor of Dallas. The same time, maybe some of you on the call were in Kansas when your current Congressman Emanuel Cleaver served as your mayor. So between my friendship with Mayor Cleaver and former Governor Ceballos and many others, a great relationship. This is an important topic for tonight. And I know to some degree we run the risk of preaching to the choir. But I want to frame this a little bit in a historical context, and then we'll open it up for questions. But one, I pray, hope in all seriousness that everyone on the call and your families are safe, and for the most part have escaped the worst of this incredible pandemic that we're living through, that I don't know that any of us have experienced anything similar to it, and I don't know that any of us thought it would bring our country's economic output and activity to a halt for the now going on 6-7 months that it has. But if you think about the last time we went through something this uncertain, and I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, we've all been reading about comparisons between this pandemic and the great flu of 1918, quickly followed by the Great Depression. The one thing we know in retrospect, looking back perhaps, what could we learn from that? What do we do differently? What do we not do? The one thing we know that prolonged the Great Depression was the passage of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. And we took what had been reasonably modest American tariffs at the time and raised them to an average of almost 60%. And I know this is a reasonably sophisticated audience, but I will remind you at every chance that I get, notwithstanding what this administration tells you, tariffs are taxes on American businesses and families, whereby the government tries to influence your purchasing decisions by making it more expensive to buy something not made in the US. That might be something you want to do, but that should be a matter of a business-to-business decision, an individual decision. And at the end of the day, we know tariffs ended up hurting our own economy, costing us jobs, and some have argued prolonged the Great Depression by a number of years. You fast forward that now, and to some degree in the context of our discussion tonight about tariffs and trade and what the outlook is, the current administration has a firm belief that an aggressive tariff policy used in a punitive way to try to change the behavior primarily of China, but we've also used it against longtime allies like Mexico and Canada and Europe on steel and others, would be the best way somehow to jumpstart our economy and bring back the jobs that President Trump promised. But sadly, the reality has proven that's not the case. It's no more of a thoughtful, effective tool to both compel behavior or create jobs now than it was in the 1930s. Now, to be sure, I was privileged to serve as U.S. Trade Representative to President Obama, who was elected to office with the same promise to renegotiate NAFTA that not only President, then candidate Trump made, but also Hillary Clinton. And our administration, as Raj noted, was as bullish on holding China's feet to the fire in terms of protecting U.S. intellectual property and putting in place the systemic measures that we wanted them to do to open up their economy. So I don't quarrel with President Trump shining a spotlight on China's behavior. And to be sure, whatever you think of the current administration's policy, we cannot let China off the hook, because clearly under the leadership, I think, of President Xi, China is taking a much more internal looking policy going forward. They're much more mercantilist than they have been over the last 20, 30 years when they quickly became one of the larger export markets for us. But the question is, does any of this make sense for you? And forgive me, Raj has been too kind, and you've heard them use, every time you hear them use the term ambassador, I want you to think, this guy's a mayor. He's no, he's no trade geek. This is just a former mayor, salesman going around the world promoting Dallas, promoting foreign trade zones. Eric, you should be happy. I mentioned foreign trade zones now. But I understand that if we can't make the benefits of trade more relevant to your friends, your neighbors there in Kansas that probably believe like Americans, like too many Americans, that trade's responsible for just about every factory being closed, then they've had that reinforced. In all of our political elections, if nothing else, political elections are the worst friends of aggressive, thoughtful trade policy as any event in America. Because this is the one time Democrats and Republicans all come together and tell you our economy is losing our way, our jobs are going overseas, and they all point to that dastardly trade policy as the rationale. And the reality is the overwhelming number of manufacturing jobs in our country have been lost due to the fact that we're just so damn much more efficient than we were 70 years ago. Most of the job loss has been due to automation on the factory floor, and now the anxiety over our artificial intelligence heightens that. But it's a lot easier to blame it on this obscure trade policy than on the fact we need to make sure we're investing in our young people's education, we're maintaining our competitive edge, we're protecting our intellectual and work product. And you do all of that through smart, thoughtful trade policy. But as we put this in the context of this current election, I think those of us who believe in trade as a tool to rebuild our economy, extend our reach around the world from not just military and strategic alliances, but also the economic alliances, we have to make sure we do our homework and that we explain to Americans that as blessed as we are to live in the strongest, most robust economy in the world, if you take, anything from our talk tonight, just always lead with this. We are only 5% of the world's consumers now. And I know there are a number of businessmen and women who are on this call. And rule number one of business, whether you're in Kansas or New York or Mexico City or Dallas, used to always be proximity. Where they're the largest numbers of users of what I'm selling, what I'm purchasing, what I'm making. Well, through the power of technology now, that is the world. And the simple reality, we can't sustain this incredible way of life that we have built and pass it on to our children if we aren't engaged in the world. And the way we are engaged in the world is by extending our reach into new markets through vehicles like the renegotiated North American Free Trade Agreement, but I would argue more urgently like the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership that would have anchored us in the Asia-Pacific region, in the fastest growing economic zone in the world, under terms, under conditions that the United States largely would have helped put in place and would have been as effective sort of a block against China taking over that part of the world as anything else we've done. So one, we don't want to go it alone. It is not in our economic interest. It's not in the interest of your friends, of your neighbors, for us to build this sort of cone of American exclusivity where we don't go out and compete and engage for all these new consumers, whether they're in India, China, Africa, Brazil, or the rest of the world. But two, we have to make sure that our friends understand that as counterintuitive as it might be, the last 50 years were mostly defined by the U.S. helping to largely bring prosperity to the world by convincing allies, former combatants, to lay down their arms and instead of engaging in strategic warfare, build economic bonds. We did that through the Marshall Plan. We did that with Japan after World War II, and it worked. And largely we gave them access to our market, and they have benefited from that. But now that many of these countries have matured, have markets of their own, it's our time. And what too many Americans don't believe is that now, whether it's India, Africa, Asia, there are consumers all over the world who believe that Made in America is the most powerful brand in the world. And rather than retreating from global economic engagement, now's the time for the US to double down. Rather than putting up barriers, as the Trump administration has done with these senseless tariffs that are ridiculously punitive, especially to American farmers and agricultural exports, we need to be removing barriers. We should be encouraging more of our businesses to engage in foreign trade, because a great way to create jobs in Kansas City, in Dallas, and our surrounding areas is to export more of what we grow, what we raise, what we create, what we innovate, what we produce to countries around the world. But I think it is going to be a difficult rebalancing act, no matter who wins the administration. And I'm going to try to come to a close here so we can take your questions, because there is an incredible sense of frustration among both political parties that China has not played by the rules, that China does need to be held accountable, which they do. But I think most of us, at least I certainly believe, there is a more thoughtful approach to do that. And we shouldn't do it in a way that hurts America's exporters, our manufacturers, our farmers, or our families, as our current policy has been. So why don't I mean, Raj, I think I've gone on a little more than I wanted to, but I'd be curious. I don't have access, know whether there's questions in the chat room, but I want to open it up to make sure we're talking about those issues that are important to RC members there in Kansas.
Well, thank you very much. And Matthew and I are monitoring the chat function. And in the meantime, perhaps I would start with a question that picks up on several of the points you made. 25% of all the cases that have ever been brought under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 have been brought by the Trump administration. The Trump administration has launched about 8 total investigations. 5 of them have been concluded, and they have all, the 5 that have been concluded have all said that imports are threatening to impair our national security. So the question is this: as a matter of substance, what should the role of national security be in trade decisions? And as a matter of style, how should those decisions be made? For example, should they involve the USTR with the Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of Defense? What would you advise the new president, whoever it might be, on this trade national security relationship?
Well, the Trump administration, just to make sure, and I know this is a sophisticated audience, but Section 232 is a rarely used provision in the trade law that says if it is a critical issue of national security, usually found in a formal, thoughtful process in which all of the different parties that Raj mentioned have participated. The Secretary of Defense, the National Security Council, and others, that if it's a matter critical to our underlying security, then you can use trade and tariffs as a tool to try to stop the flood of those imports. Typically, this will, in limited cases, involve technology, cyber instruments that have a legitimate civilian person, but on purpose, but that could more easily be manipulated to put into a military presence. But it's rarely used because, one, whether we like it or not, the United States holds the position of power and authority that we do, not only within the World Trade Organization, but at NATO and the G8 and others, is because we are generally seen as the one group trying to get everybody to play by the rules. And if we manipulate the rules, then every other country will come in and do the same thing. And what you end up with, Raj, is this downward spiral of closed markets that defeats the purpose of making sure consumers, businesses have access to the tools they need. It ends up hurting us. but it's rarely used. It has never been used in the manner in which this United States, I mean, as I told people, and forgive me, you all know I'm a Democrat, you know who we are. As I've said frequently, we don't have a trade policy. We have a Twitter policy. The president wakes up in the middle of the night, depending on whether some leader has given him a golden globe or said something unkind, he tweets a bunch of stuff. And then we have to run behind it, make sense of it. It makes us look foolish. It is a waste of our time and resources. In most cases, it has not resulted in helping our economy. And it's hard to argue in this case where the administration used it to all of a sudden decide that BMW and Mercedes production, most of which are built in the southeastern United States, are a threat to national security. So there's a reason you gave the statistics you did, Roz, that it's been used so sparingly, is because it should be. Because again, yes, we have a fundamental responsibility to protect the intellectual work product, the cybersecurity of the United States, of our people, our citizens, our businesses. But we shouldn't use that tool in such, I think, an arbitrary manner, the current administration. Because remember, we sell a hell of a lot of these products to other countries. I mean, Boeing can't sell any more airplanes in the United States. But for the Emirates and other countries buying those planes, Boeing would be in real trouble. So whether it's Boeing or Caterpillars or Fords, we put our own exports at risk when we engage in that kind of behavior in such a thoughtless way.
You mentioned that we don't have a trade policy, we have a Twitter policy. And one of the recent communications that was quoted in yesterday's Financial Times was that if we did not do business with China, we would not lose billions of dollars. It's called decoupling. And the era of economic surrender is over. Those remarks were, of course, from President Trump. Now, after going through 4 waves of tariffs, very damaging tariffs, as you mentioned, the trade war seems to be entering a new phase. The US is threatening to delist Chinese companies from American securities exchanges if those companies do not basically play by US transparency and accounting rules. In fact, universities have been warned that their endowments should start thinking about divesting from Chinese stocks. And we're also seeing enormous pressure on TikTok and WeChat. They may be banned from the country. And of course, we're seeing a number of sanctions against companies like Huawei. This is very different from just a tariff war. This is a more profound level of decoupling. And we would love to have your thoughts on this kind of broadening and deepening of the trade war and where it might be headed.
Well, I want to be careful about some of these because you did know that I co-chaired international trade practice at Gibson, Dunn, which is a global law firm with more offices outside of the United States, including in Beijing and Hong Kong and Shanghai and Singapore. And so some of those I can't. But the danger, look, the brilliance of Donald Trump, he takes ridiculously complicated matters and he can reduce them to a tweet. And in a world in which Americans' attention span sometimes is not the longest, that can be a powerful tool to shape public opinion. The challenge is that it is such a complex issue. As you noted, our administration's general approach was that it is not our place to tell China or Russia or Mexico or kind of whatever country what kind of economy government they want to have. It is our place to say, to the degree that we've all agreed through our covenant of the World Trade Organization, that if we're going to compete in this global marketplace, we should compete by the same rules. And to the degree China has companies that are largely state-owned or partially state-owned, I think it's absolutely imperative that we say to China, we've got to find some way to level the playing field if you're going to finance them at 0% interest, provide their labor, they don't have to have insurance. That's very different than what the Trump administration is doing, is basically playing to Americans' economic anxiety. And China's the fault of everything, whether it is the quote unquote China flu, as we've done in the case of the COVID flu or others. He is cynically taking what is a very challenging issue and just reduced it to this simplicity that you've got to blame somebody for your current economic plight without recognizing the fact that for all the challenges we have with China in the 25 years now, plus years that China has been a member of the World Trade Organization, they have become one of our most important trading partners behind Mexico and Canada. And as a Texan, shame on me for not reminding you, for everything else, still the most spectacularly successful trading arrangement in the world is the one we have in North America between Mexico and Canada, almost $3.5 billion a day. And we benefit from that. And certainly our farmers, our ranchers, many of our U.S. businesses are benefiting by helping China build the institutions, the infrastructure, the systems they need to move another, 800 million plus people from an agrarian lifestyle to a modern one. So, I mean, what I guess I could say is, Raj, as my father used to always say, there's two sides to every story. Make sure you tell both sides. I mean, we can't just look at China from the problems and ignore the fact it is and potentially could be a spectacular destination for U.S. produced goods and services. And we shouldn't throw all of that out the window. And there are other ways to encourage and engage China to reform their behavior. The most powerful the powerful source, I believe, is China now is building an innovative and creative class that are making the same arguments of their government to protect their work product that U.S. companies have been. And as you know, it's much easier to get a country to do something for their own self-interest than it is because they've gotten another lecture from the United States.
You mentioned NAFTA, now rebranded as the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, and that was something that, of course, President Obama had expressed an interest in renegotiating. My question's about complexity. As you mentioned, that trade is complex, and many of the changes in the USMCA from NAFTA 1.0 involved greater complexity on rules of origin, particularly in autos. And a labor value content, a regional value content, steel and aluminum. What's your perspective on the USMCA, how it turned out? What might you have done differently? And what do you think generally about legal complexity when we're trying to build relationships, as you say, with Mexico and Canada?
Well, that's almost more of an answer than a question. And one, NAFTA was due for an upgrade. NAFTA was passed, I think, I can't remember if you noted or in our previous chat room, I think it was Eric Alter was telling us he was on the Hill when we passed NAFTA. I think it finally went into force in 1995. But just in 1995, if we're in the middle of a crisis like we are today, we aren't meeting because there was no internet, there was no email, there were no cross-border transactions. And so NAFTA was the best architecture for what we call a multilateral trade agreement that existed at the time. But it had its failings. It did not, we were just beginning to think about the impact of how we produce goods globally on the environment. The labor provisions were separate. And going forward, we learned from that. And in the 30 plus years since, we've never done a trade agreement that didn't have embedded in it, provisions as it pertained to protection, respect of workers' rights, protection of the environment, but we've also learned that we conduct business differently than what we did. So one, NAFTA was due for an update. Our approach in the Obama administration was a great way to modernize NAFTA was via the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, as you know, which was going to be the largest, would have been, and is now, minus the US, the largest multilateral trade agreement done since GATT. And within that, most of what is in now the US-Mexico trade, Canada agreement, 95% of that had already been done and upgraded in NAFTA. But as you know, this president has a penchant more for adding layers of complexity than liberalizing and opening markets. And I'll be honest, I think in order to get it passed and say, look, I did something different, it was easier for him to go in and change some of the rules of origins content as it pertains to the production of autos, the wage rates for the workers on those, than the substance of the agreement, which had largely been updated versus the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And as I like to say, I mean, look, it is a sad day when the best we can hope for is that the administration didn't blow something up. I mean, again, as we say in Texas, what the Trump administration did with NAFTA was knock on your front door and said, oh, Professor Bhala, we just wanted you to know we put out that fire behind your garage. And you're like, what fire? While you sit there, look at this gasoline-soaked kid who now wants a parade for putting out the fire they started. But to the deeper issue of this economy and the anxiety of American families about jobs, whatever you think of NAFTA, it is an updated version of what we had. The Trans-Pacific Partnership would have opened up billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of new economic opportunity for us. And so I just don't think we can accept an updated NAFTA as a substitute for all of the new market access that we would have achieved through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And just as importantly, the challenge now, because the administration had such a bias in favor of doing smaller deals, in this case, we've actually created a perverse incentive for American businesses now who are going to be at a huge competitive advantage by not being in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and being subject to tariffs of anywhere from 25 to 100%. The crazy thing now, if they just ship those goods across the border, if they can be exported into the Trans-Pacific Partnership out of Mexico and Canada. So it looked like a victory on paper for the Trump administration, but it's certainly not been a victory for American manufacturers and farmers.
Well, the last major foreign trip, if I recall correctly, that President Trump took just before the travel bans with the pandemic was to India. President Obama was a fan of India, and Vice Presidential candidate Kamala Harris, of course, is of Indian origin. The outcome of the Trump trip has yet to be seen. It's at best, like you were suggesting, a small deal. There's a lot of controversy on both sides. The Indians are upset that the U.S. has withdrawn its generalized system of preferences, trade preferences, GSP, and the U.S. is upset at non-tariff barriers in India. What's your advice as to what U.S. Indian or Indo-American trade relations should look like? And I might add, it is the world's largest free market democracy. If we are in an era of strategic competition, great power competition, this seems like such a natural, and yet it's been a tough nut to crack for several administrations.
Well, I warned you of my colloquialism, and notwithstanding our kinship because of my good friend Kamala Harris, who I can see from the smile on your face, you claim as proudly as I do, but in the trade world, we have this fairly crude but true saying that, you know, the Indians are poets and the Chinese are businessmen. And notwithstanding whatever President Trump would do, look, the bigger issue is, I believe this administration, because of its crude, bullish approach to international engagement in every forum, has so alienated the world that we are going to have to carefully construct a new message, and one that the United States believes in solving problems that should be solved on a global nature together. I mean, this pandemic is the perfect example. Why the hell are we withdrawing from the World Health Organization when we should be leading the world in a coalition of the willing to defeat this horrible disease that has shrunken the world more than anything in our lifetimes? None of us are safe from it, no matter where we live, no matter our race, religion, nationality. You would think if there was anything to bring us together to say, let's defeat this, we would do it. We started by withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, then the Paris Accords, challenging the validity of NATO, everything else. Our broader mission, and I would say this as someone who supports Vice President Biden, I think the world will excel and know that at least the United States will be back at the table. But if we believe that by our decoupling from all of these institutions, they've all just sat on their hands and said, well, I guess we should do nothing, you know, until the United States comes back, we're fooling ourselves. Any of the businessmen and women on the table who have lost business in China because of these tariffs knows China has moved to find other sources. And whether it's Canada or Europe or Brazil, the rest of the world has found there are other willing trading partners. So it's going to be difficult, but it will be important that we have an administration to realize that that's a journey that we have to begin, and that we have to respect our potential, our strongest partners, and then build and restore those partnerships, whether it's with India, whether it's with Mexico, Brazil, and the rest of the world. But I do think India is such an attractive market just because the scale of it is like nothing we've seen. But as you noted, Raj, India is still more dominated by agrarian politics than any of the emerging markets. And it has been very difficult going back to, you mentioned President Obama, and the first state, you know, official state dinner we hosted was for Prime Minister Singh, and who was an economist by trade and had very ambitious goals to open up the economy. But it takes, as my father would say, it takes pushing on an open door to get something done. But hopefully we can get a rebalancing and a beginning of that journey after these elections in November.
You mentioned the withdrawal not only from the TPP, but also the World Health Organization, and that led me to think about a topic we haven't touched on too much, and that's the future of the World Trade Organization. You were, of course, USTR when there were a number of controversial cases that the U.S. either brought or defended, and the argument or perspective that the WTO appellate body was judicially active started gaining traction then. And that has now sort of taken hold. And of course, as you know, the WTO appellate body died in December of 2019.
But it died principally because the United States blocked the appointment of the judges. And to your point, I want you to finish your question, but we brought more cases. I brought more cases against China during my tenure as USTR than any USTR before. And we were 10 out of 10. But we were successful because we knew it's easier for China to come to a resolution of, to change their behavior if it seemed in the context of a global event than that them kowtow into the U.S. And so almost every case that we brought against China, We did so in a partnership with the European Union, Canada, Mexico, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. I mean, it was almost the same group. And then we could get them in a room and say, look, you've made these commitments and you've got to do that. And I mean, we cannot have a view of the world that the appellate body only works when we get a result that's favorable to us. And unfortunately, that's just one more place where I think this administration has failed us. The appellate body is more needed now than ever. We are reaching a saturation point in terms of new bilateral and multilateral agreements. So most of what we want to accomplish to either protect American interests or extend them is going to be getting countries to comply with the agreements they've made. And the appellate body is crucial in that process.
Absolutely. And in fact, that you hit exactly on the question, is that now that it's been temporarily replaced with an interim arbitration agreement, what's next? How, if you are advising the new WTO Director General, who's currently being selected, as you know, what's your advice to her or to him as to what to do about appeals, and more generally, what to do to make the WTO relevant again?
Well, the thing is, that's very difficult for the Director General who works for the members to accomplish. And the sad thing, Raj, again, this is one more case, just as in, and I hate to keep digressing, when the United States pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the real tragedy is that we were largely the force majeure to bring these 12 economies together. And if I can simplify this for those of you not total trade geeks on the call, as I tell people, for those of us who love to travel, at least we live with this fiction that we're going to get a better deal when we go into a duty-free store at an airport. Well, we just built the biggest duty-free store in the world and then said, you know what, everybody can shop here but American consumers. And that is punitive to us. And the rest of the world didn't stop buying. Those 11 other countries have now moved on without us. And as in the case of the WTO, while the United States has blocked the appointment of this important appellate body, now sadly, Europe, Canada, Mexico, Australia, China, other countries have now created basically sort of an adjunct appellate body exclusive of the United States. So we have done nothing to further our interests or to protect American businesses with our behavior. And all I can hope is if we do have a change of administration, that the new administration will immediately re-engage with the WTO, stop the blocking of those appointees, re-engage with the World Health Organization, rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. And I know this is great, we haven't talked, Mina, re-engage with our partners to make sure Iran doesn't get and deploy nuclear weapons. But, you know, as you know, their number one job is going to be to defeat this pandemic and get the economy going. But in a perverse way, the way I look at it, that's low-hanging fruit. I believe a President Biden will appoint a competent Secretary of State, United Nations Ambassador, U.S. Trade Representative, and tell them, I've got to go focus on defeating this pandemic and restoring our economy. I need you to take the lead in restoring our international prestige. And I would say it almost seems cruel to compare this to, and at least cruel to President Bush, to compare it to Trump. But when we came in office, I would say the genius of President Obama of appointing then Senator Clinton as Secretary of State helped to almost immediately sort of flip the script on what the world perceived as a go-it-along America policy to one to knowing, okay, we're ready to talk and we're ready to engage.
Let me remind all of our viewers, we've got, and correct me if I'm wrong, Matthew Hughes, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I certainly don't want to monopolize the questioning. So please type in your questions or send them via Matt some way, and I would love to have them posed to the ambassador. In the meantime, as we're waiting for some new questions, let me ask you about Brexit. Today, basically, or the last few days, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said that Parliament will consider the UK Internal Market Bill, which his own Northern Ireland secretary told Parliament would break international law, basically by rewriting the terms of the withdrawal agreement between the UK and the EU. The UK, as many of us, I'm sure you know, is trying to negotiate a free trade agreement not only with the EU, but also Australia and the United States. Where's Brexit headed? And what advice do you have for the new administration, whoever it is, on dealing with the UK?
I don't know. First of all, I don't know that any member of Parliament can tell you where Brexit is headed, so I'm not going to at all try to. I'm having a hard enough time getting Kansas. I've been chastised several times rightly by my friends for reminding me Kansas City. I'm in Missouri. We're in Kansas and not Missouri, so I'm going to stay away from Brexit. But there are a number of question and answers in the chat room. I don't know if Matthew wants to pick out a couple or not, but a number of people have talked about our decoupling, and one question was about the effect of the tariff war. As you heard Raj mention in our overview, President Trump, I think incorrectly, almost equates our success in trade in terms of our deficit, and that if we have a trade deficit, all imports are bad and good, and his rationale for his tariff war was that we would rebalance trade. Well, today, I think it was announced we have the highest trade deficit in history. Our exports, some numbers I was looking at yesterday, Raj, our exports have fallen almost 16% year over year in terms of merchandise and 28% in services. And that latter number is startling to me, because the one place the United States always has a healthy surplus has been in agricultural exports and services. But across the board now, because not only of the tariff war with China, but again, you mentioned the 232 national security tariffs, we have put ourselves at odds with Europe, Canada, Mexico, Brazil. The net result is we've only hurt our own industries more, and our trade deficit has exploded. For those of you that don't, maybe just deal in this world, as counterintuitive as it is, the healthier our economy is, the more we import. One, because we are importing byproducts to make goods that many times we turn around to the world. So the notion that all imports are bad doesn't make sense. If you're making an airplane, many of the raw materials that go into much of our high-end technology is sourced from Asia, from Africa, from emerging markets. Cutting those off means we are hurting our own ability to take those raw materials, turn them into whatever these products are that we're selling. So it's a somewhat sophomoric view of how trade works. But if you look at the numbers by Trump's own definition, our policy has failed miserably because our trade deficit has actually exploded. Raj, you've got to unmute.
We do have a couple questions, Raj, if you'd like, from the audience that I think we can cover, and Ambassador, with your permission, we might extend by another minute or two. But we have a question here from Jack Zhang, who's asking about basically what the Biden platform would be for trade going forward, saying that it could be argued that the Biden campaign's progressive trade platform is more protectionist than Trump, with its emphasis on reshoring supply chains. Can a Biden administration effectively champion free trade abroad while ramping up industrial policy at home? And will US allies tolerate efforts to reduce US reliance on foreign goods or to subsidize American companies?
Zhang, that is the most complex question that the answer, I would argue, to all of them is yes. Onshore, look, the American business, no matter what we think, largely operates in their naked self-interest. And to some degree, the best advocate for what we call onshoring, reshoring for a lot of American business has been China's behavior and China's refusal to protect American intellectual property and China's persistent efforts to try to get them to turn over their core trade secrets. And American business, frankly, cannot be exempted from this discussion because they saw the benefits of relocating manufacturing in China as far outweighing the cost of China pilfering off a little bit. But when that pilfering becomes a grab and then extends into your heartbeat, it's time for you to either decide, one, I don't have to be in China. You know, the hardest call any company has to make is when they have to call the governor of Kansas and call the mayor and say, we're sorry, but we're moving our facility to Mexico, to China. When China or Mexico threatens their economic livelihood, they owe them nothing and they will pick up and leave. And my point is, part of the magic of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so much of what you're seeing being assembled in China is not made in China, it's just finally assembled there, is going to ultimately move to places like Vietnam and Pakistan, if India ever gets their act together, to India or Africa. And business will largely be the impetus for that movement. But I believe Vice President Biden will not yield on the argument that China has to play by the rules, go through the systemic changes we've talked about, protect America's intellectual property, but I think he will bring a more thoughtful approach to also making sure we protect the hard-won gains that we've had thus far. But I want to be careful. I am not speaking for the Biden administration. I have no formal role with it. I've got to tell you, being a pro-trade Democrat's a pretty lonely caucus at a Democratic convention.
We've got a question. Progressives often approach the topic of trade with a great deal of skepticism, especially when it comes to the environment and the carbon cost of engaging in trade. What are a few tangible steps the U.S. could take to help decarbonize international trade?
Wow. Well, I would say, I don't know how you define progressives. They would not include me in that definition. You know, look, for all of the fault we're giving China, I still believe market forces are going to help to decarbonize more than what we're doing. I think government should be smart. Full disclosure, I'm a big believer in nuclear power. Nuclear is the cleanest, most reliable source of non-carbon electricity. It accounts for 70% of the clean energy produced in the US. China is furiously investing in nuclear and wind and solar and electricity. I believe the coupling of China's imperative to know that they have to address what has become an economic issue for them in terms of businesses not wanting to locate there because of the pollution, and they have the force to make it happen, coupled with what I mentioned, that the United States has not done a trade agreement in the last 30 years that didn't have in it at least broad commitments, whether it's about sourcing, production, to do so in an environmental responsible way. That is another reason I think it was such a tragedy that we withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because many of these economies would just as soon say, you know what, that's a box we don't have to check. Through APEC, which was actually the precursor, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperative, one of President Obama's biggest initiatives that we achieved was getting an agreement among the 21 members of APEC that we would not tax environmental goods and services that help us achieve the goal of decarbonization. So I would say the United States has, you know, an admirable track record on that, but there's more to be done. But you won't do any of it if you aren't at the table engaged with our allies in the broader context of trade.
We're at the end of our hour, but as Matthew said, if we can beg your indulgence and maybe get one more question. The question is, you mentioned that many individuals blame trade for the loss of jobs. What can we do to change the public perception and understanding of international trade? Question very relevant now, of course, during the campaign season.
Yeah. You know, Raj, and I don't know who asked the question, that is the most important issue of our time. It is very complex. I wish I had a short answer for you. I still go back to the more we can connect jobs here in the United States with the economic prosperity for our kids, to a thoughtful trade policy that makes it possible for us to exploit these markets the way they have us, the more people will listen. If you talk to people about free trade, their eyes gloss over and they gotta want to hear it. Yeah, we get cheaper laptops, iPads, t-shirts, but all the jobs have gone to China. If you tell people 95% of consumers live somewhere else, and what if we could have a trade policy that said, you know, Japan, Brazil, Russia, India, you've benefited through the general GSP from selling us goods. Now it's our turn. People go, yeah. And you can't take our products and copy to them and steal them. You've got to protect our work part. Most people go, yes. And you know what? We want to partner with you to help you achieve your goals of modernization. And by using American software and services and technology, most people say, yeah. It's kind of like the Affordable Care Act. If you go through the component parts, it has 70% favorability. If you call it Obamacare, then everybody goes, oh, I hate that thing. Well, we have to break trade down to its component parts. And those of us who believe in trade have to understand the pain of those who don't. Raj mentioned that I'm married, which I am, to a fabulous woman, a graduate of the Wharton School. But my wife was an ABC kid. She grew up with an absent father, very challenged circumstances, got a scholarship to go to boarding school, went to Wharton, and she was raised in Cleveland and Detroit. And I tell you that to frame this. So I've been going to Cleveland, Detroit for 33 years, and I see that not everybody embraces trade the way I do as a mayor of Dallas, in which Texas is spectacularly the largest benefit of our trade policy. I understand the pain of those out-of-work steel workers and factory workers all throughout the Rust Belt. But we've got to talk to them honestly and help them understand not every factory closed because of NAFTA. Some of this, we didn't make wise investments. We've got to re-educate our workforce. We have to invest in our children. We can engage, we can compete, we can win. If we hold our trading partners' feet to the fire, that's the best way to do it. And I've gone on the factory floor at Boeing. I am most proud of a scathing editorial the Wall Street Journal wrote about me my second year as U.S. trade rep, in which they call me America's do-nothing trade rep, because after my first year in office, I pulled my staff in, and this is a true story, and I said, you know what? Our problem isn't in Colombia and Panama and Mexico. Our problem's in Detroit and Maine and the Carolinas, and that's where I'm going to go. And I went to those communities, and I sat down with those displaced workers in businesses. I invited them to tell me what they didn't like. And I challenged them and said, now, if we can produce a trade agreement that responds to your concerns, would you support that? And the U.S.-Korea trade agreement was the first agreement passed in 20 years with the United Auto Workers, all of the car manufacturers, and it got the largest number of votes in the U.S. Senate in history. So we can do it, but we've got to put the time in. We've got to put in the work. We've got to stop ridiculing those workers who feels like their livelihood's been threatened and afraid for their future. And if we can help them understand that if we can do it in Kansas, if we can do it in Dallas, they can do it in Eastern Pennsylvania. They can do it in Detroit. And if we do that through groups like the International Relations Council, the Foreign Trade Zone Coalition, hopefully we can turn this thing around.
Well, that brings us to the conclusion of the time, and I'll turn it over to Matthew to finish the proceedings, but thank you so very much. Mayor, Ambassador Kirk.
Well, look, first of all, you know, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. Raj, I was asking you beforehand what the challenge of teaching. You said you can't see your students, but at least 60 people stayed with us. I hope they're not all in their pajamas and throwing popcorn at the screen, but you all are very kind, at least, and they're not all leaving mass at once. And I hope I had said something to inspire you to get involved and stay involved in the political life of our community and help make the case that trade not only can be, needs to be an integral part of our economic revival.
Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us. And I really can't imagine a better start to the Choices Election Issues series. So thank you so much for lending your insight and perspective this evening as we all grapple with these very serious and critical issues. We would like to again thank our supporters for their help in putting on this program. Our supporting series sponsors, Nancy C. Messer, the University of Missouri, and Buttonwood Financial Group. We're especially grateful to this evening's Global Conversation sponsor, the Greater Kansas City Foreign Trade Zone. And Al, we do apologize for the technical difficulties, but we do appreciate your support, as well as sustaining conversation sponsors, Nicole Gresham Perry and the International Trade Council, as well as our educational partner for this evening, the Bertelsmann Foundation. Again, we hope that you'll visit us at irckc.org for information about additional upcoming programs, including the remaining 7 programs in the Choices Election Issues series. And we wish you all a very pleasant evening.
Matthew, before you go, the mayor in me will not leave an audience like this. I know you're sophisticated, but please make sure you vote. Vote early. I don't know if that's available in Kansas, but obviously there's a lot of concern about in-person voting. But the easiest way to not get caught up in the mail-in absentee balloting, take advantage of the opportunity to vote. But I know you get tired of people saying this is the most important election of our lifetime, but for the issues we talked about, we care about, they aren't going to be resolved unless we all exercise our civic duty and go to the polls. So put on your mask, put on a smile, and make sure you get out and vote.
Ambassador, thank you so much. And Raj, thank you to you, and thank you to our audience. We'll see you all next time. Take care.